Pulls and more pulls. What dangers await? The final years of my electrical apprenticeship were served as part of the Middle electrical line crew. This crew was responsible for yard lighting, communication lines, and power line maintenance around the mill site and the Stillwater power station where two large power generators were located. These generators fed power to the local paper mill grid. Our crew looked after the poles, which ran high voltage power from the substation to the Lowest River Dam. The telephone line was also attached to these poles and ran from the power station to the BC Tel connection at Highway 101. Tuesday, September the 2nd, 1965, is a date well engraved into my memory bank. We had been given the task of replacing the older telephone wires with new ones. The wire and fittings had been dropped off by the line truck crew at the start of the pole line, a short distance from the generation station. Jack Gavin, the driver groundman, then drove the line truck up to the highway awaiting our arrival. Journeyman lineman John Coe and I now walked the pole line, attaching the new wire and inspecting each pole as we went. After the poles were checked, the condition was noted in a book. A couple of the poles were rotten at their base and required 4 pikes to be installed at the perimeter before we could safely climb them. As an aside, should a pole break off in a run of several poles of the same height, the wires attached to the poles on either side will hold it up until it can be replaced. The nearly 1/3 mile run of 40-foot high poles, which ran to the highway, was also supporting 3 high-voltage conductors. When John and I finally reached the 2 poles which crossed the highway, we saw these structures were 66 feet in height. This was in order to get the necessary clearance over the main road traffic flow. We carefully tested our last 2 poles by jamming pointed steel probes at ground level. They sounded solid, so we climbed to our working height. Our parts bucket were lowered for Jack to fill with the needed connection components. John scampered up the pole on the top side of the highway, and I carefully climbed the pole on the lower side. We pulled up our supplies and were ready to begin. I called over to my partner and asked him to pull the wire tight so I could tie it off. I had removed my climbing gloves in order to have better feel when making the connection. John had pulled the line taut, and I was in the process of attaching it to the ebony insulator when I heard what sounded like a gunshot. Immediately, I looked towards my fellow lineman. I saw his pole had snapped at ground level and watched as the attached wires slowed his journey towards the ground. The connected wires initially acted like a brake. Shocked, I feared for his safety. It was then that I heard a second gunshot. The 3 high voltage lines attached to the 2 poles pulled on my support, and it broke off as well. I thought my heart would jump out of my chest as I found myself earthbound. I remembered being told if you were on a pole which was going down, to unclip your belt and throw yourself free to avoid being crushed. This was a great idea in principle, but pretty hard to do when you're dangling from your belt. I fell away from and swung under the pole. Quickly, I scrambled up on top, riding like a rodeo cowboy. In what appeared to be slow motion, I contemplated being crushed and dying or being impaled by the recently macheted sharp ends on the trim bracken at the pole perimeter. These thoughts quickly cleared as I fell off my temporary steed. Miraculously, as the beast was about to impact the ground, I kicked sideways and ended up on my back, parallel to the pole at my fullest extent my belt would allow. The thump had drained every bit of air from my lungs. I heard Jack's frantic call, "Are you all right?" I could only muster a weak groan. He repeated his anxious plea. I was still sucking for air, but managed a little, "I'm okay." I struggled my way along the fallen pole and up onto the road. It was then I heard John show his life. When the first pole broke, John hastily attempted to descend. Unfortunately, in his hurry, his spur hung up and held him jammed on the pole. When he fell to the ground, he had dropped into a gully with the pole above him. I asked Jack if the high voltage power had tripped out. He called the powerhouse to ask the operator. After several unsuccessful attempts, I told Jack to stand back. I would throw a ground strap over the 3 wires. This would guarantee to trip out the potential hazard should oncoming vehicle run into the live lines. Amazingly, there was no traffic in sight while our excitement was taking place, although it was whizzing by earlier. I cut the wires and cleared them off the roadway. To our surprise, the first vehicle that came along was driven by an off-duty police officer. John's only injury was a gash on his thigh where the wrench attached to his belt had impaled him. The officer said he would take John to the hospital. I got a rain jacket out from the line truck and put it on the car seat to stop John's blood from staining it. "Off you go," I said to John. "I'll clean up with Jack." Jack said I should go to the hospital too. I said I was okay. "Take a look at your arms," he said. Overshadowed by the trauma, I had not felt or noticed the surface of my arms displayed a series of red nerve endings dripping with plasma. This was the result of spinning around the circumference of the rough pole. Yes, I too took the ride. We were both attended to by the doctor in the emergency room before being sent back to the mill to be cleaned up. When I finally arrived home, I went into shock. In hindsight, we should both have been better checked over. The next day, I went to work for a 5-day period of light duty, after which I returned to regular duty. In those days, there was no follow-up regarding the injuries. An investigation of the accident was held, and it was determined both poles had a solid perimeter for the first 1 inch and turned to dry powder on the inside. They said it was not possible to determine the extent of the rot. 2 weeks later, we were given the task of replacing the poles and redressing them with new wires. I was told that I must climb the pole again to get over my nearly acquired fear of climbing. My return to the pole was somewhat shaky, but after carrying out the job, I understood the value of returning to the climbing job as soon as possible in order to prevent the fear of climbing. We were so lucky to escape with our lives.